Lake of the Ozark leaders are moving forward with the proposed curfew for minors on Bagnell Dam Strip. City officials say fake IDs, underage drinking, and late-night disturbances help prompt the plan. But as Phil Rodriguez reports, the businesses that would share responsibility for enforcing it are not saying much publicly.
Restaurants and arcades to bars and late-night crowds, the Bagnell Dam Strip attracts visitors of all ages. But after 10 at night, Lake Ozark leaders say anyone under 18 should only be here with a guardian or another legitimate reason. The proposed curfew would run from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. Police could order an unaccompanied minor to leave, contact their parents, or issue a municipal citation. Business owners or employees could also face a fine of up to $500 if they knowingly allow a minor to remain.
I guess the individual businesses, I feel like an unnecessary curfew might hurt businesses in the long run or hurt the reputation of the area.
Not everyone believes another city rule is the best answer. Jeffrey Ruiz is visiting from out of town. He says the city may be addressing a real concern, but questions how easily the curfew could be enforced.
I think they're creating a rule that it would be difficult to enforce. I think that they already have everything that they could need at the bars set up in place.
We called or visited nearly every bar and restaurant along the strip that serves alcohol. Some said their owners were not available. Others declined to discuss the proposal. Not one owner or employee agreed to an on-camera interview about a rule that could directly affect their business. The curfew would only cover people under 18, not 18, 19, or 20-year-olds who are still too young to drink. The proposal is not law yet. It's expected to return to the Board of Aldermen for a second reading July 28th. In Lake Ozark, Phil Rodriguez, KY3 News.